Meine Damen und Herren, ich heiße Sie herzlich willkommen zu der heutigen Veranstaltung. We are very glad to have Professor Bejan during his first visit to TU Berlin after so many years. Let me very briefly introduce Professor Bejan. He comes originally from Romania. He asked me to mention just one thing, that he was a member of the national basketball team in Romania. And this played a significant role in his career later. I don't know whether you are going to mention something later about that. He received his bachelor, master, and PhD degrees at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States. So with 1920, he emigrated to the United States, and he has been there since that time. After MIT, he went to Berkeley, to University of California in Berkeley, to University of Colorado in Boulder, and in the last 35 years, he has been a professor at Duke University. I'm not going to mention all the honors and awards that he has received. I checked his resume, and it takes more than 7 pages to count all of them. I will say only that there is no major award from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers that he has not received. And very recently, last year, he received a Franklin Medal, which is a great recognition of his contributions. He has 21 honorary doctorates from 12 countries, published over 30 books, and I lost count of the papers. Anyway, I had the pleasure of meeting Adrian Bejan 35 years ago, and in the beginning of the 90s we published together also with Professor Michael Moran from Ohio State University a book called Thermal Design and Optimization. Some of you are familiar with this book. And we are very lucky that he received his Humboldt Award, and he's going to spend some time here in Berlin in the coming months. Adrian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
You said the floor, but I think I prefer the stage, okay?
The stage.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming to my lecture. You look like a friendly audience, so that makes my job easy. I am very grateful to the Humboldt Foundation first, and then for its generous support of my visit. And also to Professor Tsatsaronis, who is my friend and acquaintance from many years ago, co-author and collaborator, and inspiration in many ways. Now, I know who most of you are. Meaning you are not beginning students. You think you know thermodynamics. And so I decided to organize a presentation that will introduce to you the big picture that I see. And my objective is to persuade you that the things that you think you know fit very well in this big picture. Now, the 3 words on the screen are big words. And in fact, they're a mouthful. And there's a lot to say about each of those words. And for that reason, I decided to condense the big picture into 6 very, very short lessons. So here comes the first. It's called power. Well, what about power? Now think about it. Have you noticed, and each of you, it doesn't matter where you come from, have you noticed that when you shape the wood, whether charcoal to make a fire, you're actually constructing something that looks like a pyramid from Egypt? Admit it. All of you, meaning all of us, are doing this unwittingly. Why is that? Obviously, the habit comes from a long time ago, but the explanation for the habit is in fact a very good introduction to where all this science of power, called thermodynamics, comes from. And to show you that I'm not lying to you, I made a fire at the very top with charcoal to demonstrate that if this is the shape in which you stack up the fuel, then during the 15 minutes that the fire catches on, the whole volume burns. So volumetric burning is assured by this particular shape. Now the graph teaches why this particular shape is preferred. If the shape is too shallow, then the hot volume does not draw fresh air to fuel, okay, the combustion. If the shape is too shallow, then there is too much cold air coming in, and that too much cold air is cooling the volume. And here we have two asymptotes, your left and your right, and both asymptotes are bad. The happy medium is at the intersection. The trade-off. It's always that way in nature and in everything else that people do. So in the middle is the shape that guarantees the hottest fire for the maker of the fire. Now, why was that? Why is this a good habit? Well, it is a good habit because in prehistory, going around and scrounging for dry wood at night in the cold and wet environment is really difficult. So fuel is not derisory, it's very expensive. So per unit of the fuel gathered, then this shape is most empowering for the maker of the fire. So the key word is appearing on the screen. And in fact, in the science that you've learned and called thermodynamics, that keyword is in the famous memoir of Sadiq Arnaud about the motive power of fire. And the rest is history. It's been a long road from the prehistoric fire in a hut or at the mouth of the cave to the power plants that define civilization today. I'll show you one step in that direction. It is about keeping the cave warm and dry. Fire is burning. We know to visualize the generation of heating as a stream of, this is inherited from caloric theory. Heating is a fluid, you see, that flows from hot to cold. I called it Q sub H. So the stream of heating comes from the fire. Its size is defined by the size of the fire, and through clever arrangement of the configuration of the stream called Q sub H, some of this stream flows through the space inhabited by people. So the dark portion flows through the house or the hut or the cave, and then eventually it flows into the ambient, which is the cold space called the T sub L. The rest of it, still left in white, goes up in smoke and ends up in the same cold environment called T sub L. So from a long distance, nothing has happened to the heat current that was generated by fire. All of it ends up being dumped into the ambient. except that through human ingenuity, some of us stuck ourselves in a portion of that stream to live better, to be empowered by that particular contrivance. Now, so that's the beginning of our road to civilization. Time is drawn on the diagonal. You can read that history. See, I like to make drawings, so I'll let you look at the picture, admire it. What was here, and I call it the rest is history. On the vertical is an arrow toward consuming more fuel. In the beginning, the fuel was food, okay? From the discovery of agriculture was a great jolt in the direction of more animal fuel. Then, of course, power from fire, called the Industrial Revolution. On the abscissa, another way to read the same sort of history of ours is in terms of social organization. On the diagonal, you see the growth in the world population, not mentioned because you see the so-called population explosion sounds scary, like the sky is falling. That is what you read in the news. But in the same direction, very good things happen. It's called advancement, greater wealth, and much more freedom. So think about it. All these things are natural. They happen. Now, on the screen is a one-shot view of the history of what's in your book, meaning all of your book of Thermodynamics. There are contrivances, animal or human-made, all in the blue space. And into them come streams of fuels and food, which are consumed, burnt or ingested. At the other end comes power, meaning work per unit time. And of course, there is a fraction that is necessarily dumped into the environment. We know that from the 2 laws of thermodynamics. I don't teach that here today. What I focus on is what's going on in the blue. In the blue, over the ages, there has been evolutionary change in the design of the contrivance. You can read this from the upper left to lower right. Now, in our discipline of thermodynamics, the question that is not addressed is what happens to the produced power. Do you see power banks on the landscape? These days people talk about energy storage and stuff like that, but power stored overnight is destroyed or consumed tomorrow. So that's the question, what happened to the produced power? The answer is the power was consumed instantly for the purpose of moving something on the landscape in the horizontal direction against the opposition provided by the environment. That is the whole picture. And it's drawn here in this dashed line rectangle. The blue space with all the power transformers is called engines now. The power produced by the engines is destroyed in order to push something on the landscape. That pushing is akin to putting work into a brake. The brake dissipates the power into heating that's then dumped into the ambient. You can perform this very simple algebra. What was in the beginning a rejection of QH minus W is later complemented by more rejection of size W from the brake. And so once again, from a distance, fire burns, produces QH, and the environment receives that QH 100%. Except that because of human ingenuity, or because of animal design, or because of world climate, the winds and the oceanic currents, in between, or in the meantime, things were set in motion on the surface of the Earth. Meaning what? that in the dashed line rectangle, the surface of the Earth is being changed and turned over and impacted, if you want, constantly by this tandem of engines connected to brakes. You can call it the interaction between power producers and the ambient. Or you can talk about the fact that the power generation has necessarily impact on the ambient. So that's the big picture. Now, over our history, especially the recent one, this is starting with 200 years ago, called the Industrial Revolution, the generation of power has been increasing monotonically in a significant way. Here I have 3 curves. These are the facts. These are not my ideas. These are measurements from people who like measurements. The upper curve is the power production in the United States. Well, it goes up, slow, fast, now slow. This is called an S curve. There is a blip having to do with the so-called energy crisis, which was actually a political event in 1973, then 1974, in the Yom Kippur War. In any case, you see here the history of our recent world drawn as one curve. The second curve is the same as the first, except that this time is expressed in terms of the actual movement on the landscape, namely the miles driven in the US annually. Okay, another S curve. The bottom one, which is, according to some, the most worrisome, is about the movers. The world population is also an S curve, projected to reach its plateau in the year 2050. This bottom curve comes from the United Nations. There are many conclusions to draw from this. One is that the world is not getting out of hand, because the S curves are tending toward a plateau. Another is that the so-called growth appearing to slow down, that's the S curve, is a natural phenomenon. And none of these curves look like exponentials. So when you hear people talk about the exponential growth of this, or the so-called explosive growth of this, you should smile and think of my lecture, or read my book, okay? Because it's not true, you see. All right, the second little story is about S-curves. They're everywhere if you open your eyes. I collected 4 of them here. In biology, they're everywhere when there is a population growth. The first curve up over my shoulder is the growth of the population of brewers yeast. This is what goes on in the making of beer. An S curve. Beautiful one. Next is the population of, obviously, modern society, population of people empowered by holding their hands portable radios. Next, the population of people having access to television sets. And then the third curve was the beginning of an S curve of the population of people reading one of my papers. This third curve is also an S curve. It tells you, though, that I made this drawing in the year 2010. So this is not a new slide. So S curves are everywhere. Incidentally, everything I'm showing you today is in fact predictable. I have predicted it and published it in peer-reviewed publications. So these are not tales. Here is a background way of predicting why these curves indicating size versus time should be shaped as S's. Now, when something spreads, not the actual flow, but the architecture of the flow, when it spreads on an area or inside a volume, the spreading has 2 regimes. You see this if you pour, say, a small bucket of water on dirt, or when you spill milk on the kitchen floor. where my best example is when you, say, hang around and spend time around the horse, and you look at the urinating horse. The wet spot under the origin of the fluid is spreading in the beginning as an invasion. The liquid is traveling as fingers. Maybe there are some depressions in the ground, some cracks, random or whatever. But those fingers then produce wetness around them, like say the hot dog on a skewer. The skewer is narrow, but the hot dog is wider. And the growth of that finger-shaped area is happening in an accelerated fashion. I think, anyway, the first thing here is what I call invasion. And then once the finger reaches to the end of the available space, then the rest of the spreading happens transversely, laterally, and that's called consolidation. You see this in the springtime, the floods swell the flow rate in the Danube, and then the wetness spreads laterally into the dry interstices between the river channels. I call that consolidation. In fact, I borrowed these two words from military terminology. An army invades a new territory in this fashion. First, straight and long and fast fingers. Later is the securing of the area transversely. So the S-curve is predictable from physics, and anybody can do that as a homework. As I said, what's spreading is not the flow, but the architecture of the flow. The flow could be that of distribution from one point, like pouring milk on the kitchen floor, to an area or to a volume, or it could be a flow collection from the area to one point, or from the volume to one point. In this case, it's from the volume to one point, oil extraction in the underground of Saudi Arabia. Now, the previous picture about the S-curve was the one shown here. In the prehistory of oil extraction, the well was a needle. That was, the invasion was a needle, and that's how the well produced oil to the ground point. But over time, with improvements in oil drilling technology, the needle became ramified, more complicated, to the configuration that you see today, which is that of a tree. It became arborescent. Now it's a river of oil coming from underground to the river mouth, which is at ground level. So what we have here is the evolution of the flow architecture from needle to tree. In what direction? In the direction of providing greater access from the volume underground to the point at ground level. This is the idea, which in 1996 gave birth to the Constructal Law, or the law of physics of evolution everywhere. And I'll read it to you, the way I wrote it back then. For a flow system to persist in time, and this is the physics definition of to live, that system must evolve with freedom. Without freedom, it cannot evolve. Such that it provides greater access to, obviously, to what flows. I have here a picture of the evolution of a river basin in a laboratory, a river basin that has already grown to covering the whole laboratory floor. But over time, the river basin continues to look arborescent, but it continues to get better. Better in this case, it means that the river, the basin that's happening under artificial rain flows all right, but it flows being driven by peaks or in this case sand, that are shorter and shorter over time. So erosion, we're driving water flow from lower and lower altitude, is the sign of a flow system, in this case, that flows more easily. So the evolution of a river basin, you can take this law as a definition of the direction of time in nature. This is observable time. Time is changes in what you're observing. And something else. I highlighted these three words, to evolve with freedom or access. Now, in retrospect, these three words mean the same thing. And each of you has a feeling of what that thing is if you imagine that you live in a situation where you don't have that, where you don't have the ability to evolve, to change, where you don't have freedom and you do not have access. So, the evolution of a river basin, here's the evolution of a river basin of people. This is drawn by skiers on a slope in Utah in fresh powder. It's the same thing. Everybody on the slope is, of course, doing this for enjoyment, but sooner or later, everybody comes to the clubhouse to have a beer. So that's the end of the second lesson. Excuse me, the third lesson is about thermodynamics, meaning what do the previous two lessons mean in thermodynamics. Well, first of all, 150 years ago, through the work of Maxwell, in thermodynamics came the concept of death state. A system is not at all controversial. Death is defined in thermodynamics as the state of a system where nothing moves. Nothing moves also means the system is not morphing. It's dead. Well, the antonym of that is the system in a live state. A live flow system, a live system is the one that's occupied by flows and is morphing with freedom. See that? The air compressed or expanded in a cylinder and piston apparatus, it has the freedom to change. Well, that is not a dead state system. Evolution is the phenomenon exhibited by the system, thermodynamic system, in a live state. This is my graduate book, now in the 4th edition. So if I'm wrong, then too bad, but lots of people are actually using this book, okay? So, now, a review. A very brief review of the words we speak in thermodynamics, because you see words matter, especially in science. Now, on the left side we have physics, which 150 years ago was called the natural sciences. Physics is about phenomena. One phenomenon is the name for billions of those observations of the same kind. For example, gravitational fall. You see that everywhere. Well, that phenomenon is that, you can call it many ways. I say the phenomenon is that everything has weight. You see, that's the phenomenon. For every such phenomenon, physics has become a very thin book because the phenomenon is condensed or remembered as a short statement. That statement is called law. Okay, in thermodynamics, we have three such statements. One is the phenomenon of energy conservation. In mechanics, it was what goes up must come down, from kinetic to gravitational potential energy. Same sort of idea in caloric theory. You know, heat into the water bottle before bedtime, later it becomes heat out of the water bottle from the hot bottle into the cold bed. So that's the first law of thermodynamics. The phenomenon of irreversibility, that everything by itself flows from high to low, is remembered as the second law. This third phenomenon that I'm introducing to you today, which is the phenomenon of evolution, is now codified as the Constructal Law. So one example of life flow system is the human, the individual. In the beginning, and that is such a long time ago that I cannot imagine how it was. In the beginning, it was the naked human body that you see in the anatomy book. That kind of Homo sapiens does not exist. Maybe it exists on the cold slab at the morgue. That is where this particular individual is to be found. Live specimens are in fact accompanied by contrivances. Simple ones, such as this wrench that I drew, or very modern ones, like the wrench and this artificial intelligence arm. So contrivances, or artifacts, are as much part of the Homo sapiens as the brain and the nails and everything else. Now, artifact or contrivance was a concept and word invented by the ancient Greeks. They called it mihani. Mihani is basically was originally the ropes and pulleys behind the curtain on the stage of the Greek theater. These contrivances were responsible for the surprising effects that were shocking the audience. So you can call these things tricks, or stunts, or shirt and shoes, and pencil and all these other things, and iPhone that we have today. But the point of going from left to right in the history of this new species called the human machine is that what works is kept. This is why each of us becomes not only more powerful, but also more complicated. And yes, more powerful, because artifacts, the definition of artifact is the add-on that enhances the effect of naked human effort. So machine means artifact. Automobile and motorcycle are examples, but they're not everything. Okay, so now one example of such an artifact is the power plant. 150 years ago, the ideal gas version of the steam power cycle was this on the left-hand side, the air standard cycle, or the people call it in the US the Brayton cycle, or the Joule cycle in the UK. Well, a stream of air is compressed, then it is heated at high pressure, then expanded through a turbine or through a reciprocating machine, and then is cooled by contact with the ambient, and then compressed again. The difference between power out from turbine and power into the compressor is the net power delivered to the, obviously the Homo sapiens, to whom this particular contrivance is attached. A little bit later, also in the 1800s, the contrivance became a bit more complicated through the invention of the regenerative heat exchanger, which is introduced here in the middle. It's the same story, but the second drawing is considerably a better producer of power for the user. And then in the 20th century, the drawing became more complicated. The expansion is now done through at least two turbines, one of high pressure, the other one lower pressure. At the other end, compression is done in two or more compression stages. The heat exchangers are multiplying with the hot end and also the cold end. So the history is from left to right. But why isn't it from right to left? The answer is, of course, in drawings you've learned in thermodynamics. These are the TS diagrams of the previous three. On the vertical is the temperature, Kelvin temperature. On the abscissa, the entropy. In the first drawing, you can see the four processes of every fluid packet. Compression from 4 to 1, then heating at constant pressure in a heater, and then expansion from 2 to 3, and finally cooling by contact with the ambient at the low pressure PL. There are two areas that are shaded above the pressure line and another one below the low pressure line. These areas are proportional to the losses that the particular design is cursed to experience. Irreversibility, entropy generation, exergy destruction. These are names for that, meaning quantities proportional to these two areas. And the maker of the contrivance has the urge, just like the person who shapes the fire, the urge to get more out of the contrivance. So the next design with the regenerative heat exchanger has led to a drawing with smaller areas that are in fact images of bad design. And then of course the third drawing is about the third drawing in the previous slide. What's happened from left to right? What happened is that the average temperature at which heating has been occurring, was shown here in pink, has been increasing. And in the same direction, the average temperature at which cooling has been occurring has been decreasing, shown here in blue. So from left to right, the ratio of high temperature to low temperature in degrees Kelvin is increasing. That is the recipe for, according originally with the so-called Carnot efficiency, the recipe for obtaining more power per unit of fuel burnt. And so there is a direction in time in the evolution of a power plant in this case, and that is a confirmation of the time arrow of evolutionary design according to the Constructal Law and according also to human common sense. And that brings us to the next short lesson, which is about evolution in general. I'm sure, because you live on the campus, you've been indoctrinated to associate this word with lessons out of biology. And this is why the most persuasive way for me to teach the concept of evolution is to bring up drawings of things that are called inanimate, such as a smoke plume. From a distance, all smoke plumes look the same. That is, if you look at them at high enough altitude. The book of fluid dynamics, the chapter on free turbulent flows, that is, turbulent flows that are far from solid walls, such as plumes and jets. That book teaches that in a time average description, the cross-section of the plume is round. All plumes, high enough, are round plumes in cross-section. But not all plumes are originally round. In the drawing on the right, that's a campfire. Yes, the plume was basically round to begin with. But the smoke coming from a power plant or a firehouse that's long is originally a curtain of smoke. So the surprise, meaning the one that I teach, is that plumes may have all sorts of shapes in the beginning, but sooner or later they all become round. This is a one-way evolution of a drawing, in this case the drawing of the cross-section. Plumes that are round to begin with never become flat in cross-section. You see? Now, there is a reason for this one-way evolution of the drawing of the cross-section. It is that when the drawing is round, then the momentum from the fast flow is this is what flows, momentum flows laterally to the stagnant fluid reservoir with rear axis, meaning mixing is enhanced if the evolution is the way that it happens everywhere. At the bottom I have the surprise to those who attribute the word evolution to Darwin. Evolution, the word has nothing to do with Darwin. Evolution is as old as Western civilization is a word. This is a Latin verb called evolvere, and it refers to, it's a mental viewing of what happens to something that rolls out. Evolve means roll out and roll forth. When I speak these words, I imagine childbirth. Childbirth. How is that? The name for who she gives birth to everything. The everything is called the physis or physics today. That person, female, is natura. So nature is in fact giving birth to everything through this phenomenon of evolution. Evolution everywhere. With the Constructal Law, it's easy to predict all sorts of evolutionary designs. Here I have a panoply of phenomena that I predicted and published. River basins, mud cracks. The shrinking of a solid is not random. It's actually with a length scale that's predictable. Turbulence is a constructal evolutionary design. Of course, the respiratory system, the round cross-section of all channels, such as blood capillaries and underground rivers, which today are seen as caverns. The difference between a splat and a splash, for example, drops of ink or blood. Snowflake. The snowflake is a evolutionary design that's predictable, and all animal locomotion as well. These are the facts, measurements from zoology of animal speed versus animal size. Everything that moves on Earth is on this graph. The red are the flyers, the blue are the swimmers, in between are the land movers. The two lines are the predicted curves, in this case lines and log representation for flying and swimming. And everything obviously that has evolved as a movement or animal water flow obeys the Constructal Law. Homo sapiens is moving on Earth on airplanes these days. This movement appears to deviate from the line of the flyers, but that's an illusion because the birds are flying at basically ground altitude through dense air. The airplanes are flying through a different medium of lower density. So if you account for density differences between the media, then all these movers, red, green, and blue, are falling on one line. And so the summary to the lessons up to this point is the history of thermodynamics. 200 years ago, the caloric theory and the theory of mechanics merged into thermodynamics. And that was through the work of three men, Rankine, Clausius, and William Thomson, who later became Lord Kelvin. And then in 1982, I wrote a book called Entropy Generation Through Heat and Fluid Flow, in which I decided to bring back into the stream the long-lost child of caloric theory called heat transfer. And I called this new domain thermal sciences. And then more recently, in the mid-90s, it occurred to me that the book of thermodynamics is really is voluminous, all right? But it's not about the two laws, meaning caloric and mechanics made into a thermodynamics doctrine. The book is thick because of evolutionary design. It's about how to make contrivances more efficient. So bringing evolution into the stream of theory is the state of the discipline today. The three things, caloric, mechanics, and evolution, have been in the arts from the beginning, but they've been there intuitively, you see. On the right-hand side is the way that the train of theory is running. Now, the next lesson is shorter. It has to do with the fact that what I show you looks simple, but it's in fact complicated because of some fuzz or a lack of clarity. Here is a drawing I made. This is about land animals. We know how to predict their speeds, but basically the cat is not to be confused with the elephant, you know. And we see here that in fact they look different if we go to the trouble of making these drawings to have the same size. And the same size, which is the bottom row, we see the so-called diversity. The cat is mainly belly, short legs, thin legs. The elephant is mainly legs, robust legs. In other words, from left to right, what in reality is from small to large, the lifting organ, meaning the legs occupy a greater fraction of the drawing. This fact is in fact predictable from the Constructal Law. In other words, diversity itself is predictable from the Constructal Law. Here's another way to tell the same story. With a Constructal Law, on the back of an envelope, one can predict that airplanes, in this case jet airplanes, should have a proportionality between wingspan and fuselage length. In other words, there should be a straight line on the diagonal. But on the diagonal, we have the entire history of jet aviation from the beginning, which is in the lower left corner, to today in the upper right corner. And so there's a cloud of data that is hugging the would-be diagonal. Okay? So the conclusion is the following. This law of physics is one, in this case evolution, but on the way to everything falling on the diagonal, there's a lot of jostling, fighting for what works best. But over time, through all sorts of devices, including espionage and theft, the designs are in fact getting closer to the diagonal. Another view of the same phenomenon of diversity in motion. This is the pictorial history of jet aviation during its more than 60 years. It's like looking at a hill in profile. The crest is rising. The larger models that are adopted are joined by even larger. You can read their names. But hidden in the drawing of the mountain is the fact that at any point in time, say the first decade of the 21st century, the new models are arriving, they're being adopted, meaning they're successful, they're arriving in all sizes. They're arriving big, intermediate, and small. And even more deeply hidden in this drawing is the fact that at every point in time, the small models that arrive are many, and the big ones that arrive are few. So the so-called diversity is in fact a hierarchy. And hierarchy is the next and final lesson Why does hierarchy happen? Naturally. Why? Well, it happens because movement on Earth is on an area, or inside the animal body in a volume. Well, they just stick to the area. I have on the left the most successful airport design in the US, which is the Atlanta airport. But you see this design in all the modern airports today. The movement is on an area. Every passenger arriving or leaving has to have access to untold number of points called gates. In other words, access to the whole area. And greater access is provided by two ways to move, not one. One would be diffusion or walking on the area. But the much faster for everybody is the combination of riding on a vehicle, in this case long and fast on the train, and then walking transversely, short and slow, on concourses. This is the design we see everywhere. By the way, the airport design is the icon of, or the mother of, all city block. The city block, which is the alley where the walking across the lawn, is the original design of the airport today. But we see this in other places everywhere. The movement of freight on an area is the same, and the same stuff is carried on the area by a few big trucks running fast and long, and then collaborating with many more smaller, slower vehicles that distribute the same stuff on the area. The so-called food chain is the same, two ways to flow or to live. Few fast and long predators on an elongated area coexisting with many small, slow animals, all living on the area, meaning driven by the same fuel, which is the vegetation. If you don't like these drawings, imagine the floor of an auto assembly plant is the same design. And that design of the assembly plant was inspired or led to the idea of Henry Ford, because Henry Ford in Chicago saw the design of the slaughterhouse floor. So in the slaughterhouse, the animal carcass comes in and animal parts leave transversely. The flow is different the other way. In the case of the auto plant, the parts come in and the car takes shape and leaves, drives off on its own as a whole. Okay, so hierarchy continues with this image of the fact. This is a 20-year-old image from NASA of how people are flying everywhere in the globe. These are measurements of the condensation trails left behind all flying aircraft. In other words, this image is how things are. People are moving on the globe like the red blood cells in the human body. Sooner or later, everybody and his nephew, doesn't matter where from, New Zealand or Tierra del Fuego, has to flow through the aorta of this design, which is over the North Atlantic. The aorta has two chambers, Europe and North America. That's the way it is. And it will not change. The design doesn't change. What happens as the world is flowing more because of this curve of power generation and consumption, is that all the blood vessels, the few large and the many small, are becoming bigger. In other words, more red as opposed to blue. So the conclusion is that the movement is hierarchical. That means the burning of fuel on Earth is hierarchical. And hierarchy is natural. Hierarchy is unavoidable. Hierarchy is the antonym of equality. That's nature. And now another image of the fact. I plotted here the annual fuel use of all these inhabited places on Earth, individual countries or groups of countries. The fuel use, we saw already, is hierarchical. You can read the names of these places. The data are 10 years old, okay? And on the ordinate, I plotted the annual wealth of the same groups. It's called the gross domestic product. Now, the whole world is hugging the diagonal. This is a one-to-one relationship between the rate of fuel use and rate of wealth accumulation, meaning that thermodynamics and economics are the two faces of the same coin, meaning the same natural design. So now let's review this last lesson. Fuel use becomes hierarchical naturally. Fuel use drives everything that's listed in this column. There's many more things you could add to this column. Life, human life on Earth is because fuel and food are available for consumption in order to move things. The movement with freedom to morph is life. Well, the bottom line is that the other name for the previous words is wealth. Hierarchy happens naturally. And just like the flood that comes driven by the rain and spreads over the territory that's not flooded yet, the population that is empowered by greater movement is destined or empowered to spread over the population that's not so empowered. Here, and again at the very top, we have the explanation for why the movement shown in red on the upper map arced over the North Atlantic from right to left, and not from left to right. So the history of the world is one way to read this particular slide, or predicting the future is another way to read the same slide. Now, the arcing over the North Atlantic happened because of evolutionary design. That is, greater movement comes from, greater or better contrivances. In the upper row, we have boating. By the way, boating was invented by the Neanderthal, so it's very old. It's in fact 150,000 years old. We have here the Egyptian galley, one of the boats with sails of Columbus. And then the third one is from the Navy of Napoleon. This is all or before steamships. Downstairs we have the other thing that came from Europe, which is automobile technology originally. With my apologies, because these are Peugeot cars, not German cars. The first automobile was German. I'm sure all of you know that. Okay, so we're arriving at the punchline, which is that without engineering, civilization does not exist. And the last slide is an invitation to all of you to see my lecture in its longer format, which is this book. And in it, you'll see once again that for the first time, I think, you will find in the book of physics words that traditionally do not belong in a book of physics. In particular, life, access, freedom, time, the direction of time, is not the direction of whatever the evolution of Earth to its entropy death. We have bigger problems on Earth to solve, to empower people. It's about the evolution of design on Earth, this particular time arrow. Fire, power, hierarchy or diversity belong in physics and are predictable and are unavoidable. And the evolution itself is a phenomenon of all physics. Evolution is everywhere and in everywhere. And so is freedom, by the way. With freedom and a little bit of wealth, you can purchase my book and then remember my lecture. Thank you. Sixty minutes. Sorry, less than 60 minutes.
Thank you very much. Professor Bejan for a very interesting presentation. You may ask questions. If you have problems in formulating the question in English, we can translate.
Or you can let me guess, because I'm not completely unfamiliar with German. So. And by the way, ask questions. Here's why contrivances came from right to left. It is because people, here I'm talking about the West, are brought up with the attitude of questioning, asking themselves, how can I do this better? Or speaking up against the person above and telling this person that, hey, wait a minute, your idea is wrong. And that person above could be the professor. So this attitude of questioning is not spread uniformly on the globe. And this is why the university is very important to continue this tradition of always improving the, not only the contrivances, but improving the discipline, the doctrine. So, ask questions.
Professor Ziegler.
Thank you, Adrian, for this very nice lecture, but I want to discuss the S-shaped curve with you. I agree, finally it will be S-shaped, but there will be damage caused by changing from an exponential curve to an S-shaped curve. Normally it does not go without damage. I mean, the yeast cannot evolve more because it comes to its borders, and this is why it becomes S-shaped. So if the evolution goes S-shaped, there is usually something which happens which we might not want to happen. Do you get my point?
Well, okay. What's shown here, the S curve is in fact not evolution. The S curve is about growth. Growth. I could have data here for the growth of the human embryo. Growth. Growth is not evolution.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, now I'm getting to evolution in a second. Second, the S is the splicing of two curves. Now, I like to make drawings, okay? Back when there were no computers, we made the drawings with a French curve, you see, French curve, with a template. And so I took the template and oriented it one way, and I drew at the beginning. And then I took the same template and turned it around and to make a concave arc, and I drew the so-called consolidation curve. But the first one, the first arc, which is about the growth that's proceeding in an accelerating fashion, is not an exponential. This is not an exponential. An exponential curve does not exist. No one has measured one. Now, how do I know that? Remember, exponential in this case, where time is on the abscissa, would mean y on the vertical being equal or proportional to e to the power time. Now, y proportional to e to the power time begins to rise above 0 at time equals minus infinity. Okay, that sort of thing. It's beyond our senses. No, what's happening here is that the first arc is a power wall. It's about y on the ordinate being proportional to time raised to an exponent, to a power that happens to be greater than 1. The second arc is a similar formula, except that the exponent is less than 1. So exponent greater than 1 makes the curve convex. The exponent less than 1 makes the second arc concave. And the transition from the first to the second is actually in reality smooth, because there's only one curve. Anyway, that's growth. Growth. Now that the the animal, the tree, the living body has filled its available space, meaning you arrive here at the needle in the ground. Over time, the architecture itself evolves. The architecture, that was in fact shown here in these drawings. The river basin is already a tree. It's arborescent. But over time, this image from hour to hour changes. It's the same in geophysics, the geography, the map. The map of the river basin is constantly throbbing. That's one of my first discoveries, even before basketball, was I grew up in the Danube Delta. From spring to spring, the river bank, when I would go fishing, was in a different place. By meters, not by centimeters. And, well, that's evolution. Evolution, in fact, you fall in the water if you are not aware of that. So, anyway, that's my long answer to what you bring up. So, learn from Professor Ziegler, because you see, questioning is the secret.
So, thank you for your presentation. It's a great honor to hear about you personally. I'm a student from Professor Tsatsaronis and Professor Morosuk. I've heard your name in several locations, so thank you for being here. My question is rather related to the human side of understanding how we construct principles or ideas to describe nature or life, and that is somehow by observation of what we could call constraints. But then how can we add into this constellation the fact that we are creative? How would you fit, from a philosophical point of view, the will of creation, the will of power in us as those that are observing and naming it and placing it and connecting it into like this grid of concepts?
Do you mean innovation?
I've thought about all those things and I can comment. In fact, that will be said much better in my next book. Okay? And remember to invite me to talk about my next book.
Or invite me.
No, but here's that's the way I think, okay? I'm self-interested. I like physics, I like the book, I also like math and make drawings, but I say, what about me? Really, what about me? Why should I be interested in this? And that's why I decided not to be curious about the depth of the universe. I'm not interested in that, even though I know that Klaus has said things about that. It's not that interesting. Is how I can get my stuff moved incessantly from A to B more cheaply, more easily, faster, safer. And yes, how can I live longer? How is that? I confess, I would like to live longer. Well, admit it. That's why you think the same way. That's why hospitals exist. That's why medicine will always be in demand. Oh, incidentally, that's why engineering will always be in demand. What is medicine? Medicine is the engineering of the better and better, always imperfect, animal body, animal design. So you bring up purpose. Purpose. The word purpose has many equivalents. Purpose, target, objective, direction of change. This is everywhere. I spoke of the river that constantly throbs to flow more easily. Look at your own cat, if you have a cat. What a cat does every hour of the day, it's about choices. And use the word constraints, I think, with all the respect that's due to you, that's nonsense. The life in that moment is immersed in an infinite number of degrees of freedom. The animal can move in all directions imaginable. It can make a move at every instant in time imaginable. It's freedom. That's what it is. Sure, there is a finite supply of space, as there is a finite supply of food in the food bowl of the cat, and on. But these things, I think, are not interesting. What is interesting is how every life flow system, out of this infinite number of possible designs, configurations, somehow arrives at a handful, very small number of these things. I put them in that panoply somewhere, I don't know, I forgot where. Anyway, the snowflake, the river basin, and the running greyhound. That's what I find interesting, and that's what I find useful. And also the fact that with this principle or stated direction of evolutionary design, I was able to predict the lifespan of everything, from animals to vehicles to rivers and the winds. Everything that moves has a lifespan that's predictable. It has a life travel that's predictable. If you want, a life cost that's predictable, or a lifelong consumption of fuel that's predictable. You see, these are very useful things, especially if you're an economist, to know that if this is the size of the population, then I can tell you per year the amount of whatever stuff, fuel or food or cheese that this group will need. You see here, we're arriving at the power to predict the future. Well, that's what science is for. Science is useful because with it, the Homo sapiens is predicting what will happen to it or to him or her tomorrow. Science is about making that prediction better and better, with greater and greater confidence and with greater accuracy. This is why science is useful. Science is not to brag. Science is money in the bank. The person with science crosses the North Atlantic, not the other way around. You see, the history of the world is a proof of the presence of, by the way, animal migration is the same thing. The spreading of plague is the same thing. Which is actually the flow of the wind, incidentally. All this stuff is just one answer. One answer, which I told the Constructal Law. If you want to hear that, I'll tell you that joke.
Thank you. Further questions? Before we go to the next question, perhaps since you mentioned it, can you say where the word constructor came from?
Yeah, that's right. So, since you're working slowly, I'll tell you this. It takes only 2 minutes. Listen, so at Duke University, I had the opportunity to work with students coming from all over the globe. Not many, but well chosen, and they come with different maternal languages. I come from a Latin language called Romanian. So one of my students, right when I came up with this idea, then became a Constructal Law, the student, Marcelo Herrera from Brazil. So here is Herrera speaking Portuguese, and I'm over here speaking Romanian, just joking, because when he said something in Portuguese, it sounded funny to me, and when I said Romanian, he was laughing, okay? So it was constant joking between us. So one day, Marcelo comes into my office and says with his accent, Professor Bejan, these drawings that you made, because I was predicting drawings that look arborescent, like trees. Back in the beginning, I was designing electronics to be arborescent, cooled with trees. So Professor Bejan, these drawings similar to yours are all over a book called The Fractal Geometry of Nature. And you know what that is, it's by Mandelbrot, this book about fractal geometry. Adrian was unaware of fractal anything and even less aware of the book. Here you learn, those of you who are young, that ignorance is an advantage to the thinker who is creative. So before you, if you have an idea, just jump on it. Do not go around to see whether somebody else has basically done it wrongly before you. Okay, so I didn't know about this. I said to myself, go to the Greek library, bring me this book. So I opened the book, and I flipped through it. I see a drawing similar to mine. And on page 32, I think it is, Mandelbrot, who grew up as a child in Poland, that's not a Latin-speaking territory, said that he picked the word fractal, excuse me, from the Latin word frangere, which means to snap a stick or a bone like that into two pieces, to fracture a narrow object, a slender object. And I said immediately to Marcelo, who obviously speaks Latin his way, I said, this is funny. Mandelbrot picked the wrong verb. Because you see, to fracture something has directional time in it, in the change of the drawing. It's from one large to two things that are smaller. So no, Mandelbrot should have used the antonym, which is construere, which is that of putting things together to look more and more like a drawing. I said, nature does not break things down to all the way to dust. No, on the contrary, nature is actually constructing things. And so he should have called the so-called geometry of nature constructal, not fractal. So that was the joke. Now, luckily, at the time, I had my first two papers on this idea already accepted for publication. And I was correcting the page proofs. So Adrian inserted this joke into his papers, meaning giving a name to the idea. And to my greatest surprise of my career, there was a moment of laughter in my office with this Brazilian smart guy. It was taken seriously by the readers. So that's how it became Constructal Law. Constructal, not fractal. Oh, by the way, and there's a big difference. Just in fractal geometry, there is no law of physics recognized by Mandelbrot and his followers, law of physics that justifies the picking of an algorithm to then invoke with a computer in order to make a drawing. The Constructal Law is the physics origin of the algorithm that makes a drawing that looks like something in nature. So the Constructal Law is the physics that was missing in fractal geometry.
Okay, so Mr. Professor, thank you very much for the lecture. I find myself quite interested in the subject of global warming, so I wanted to ask a question regarding this subject. So Stephen Hawking warned us that we have 100 years left to leave Earth, and this above seems to be true according to measurements of climate change, meaning the level of temperature increase, and being aware of this, we had a United Nations conference in Paris in 2015, on which all countries agreed to reduce CO2 levels, emissions, and obviously not only this, all the other greenhouse gases. And now, according to two of your slides, the first one is the S-curve about population and power growth. Yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And also the one previous, it was one of the first slides of this lecture, which was the S-curve about how the
power generation.
Yeah.
So
Okay, because Do you actually agree that, because finally we see that the provisions of the Parisian conference are not going to be fulfilled, so do you agree actually with Stephen Hawking that we can't really stop the global warming?
If we don't do anything, yes. If we don't do anything, in other words, if we do not learn anything, okay, then what nature does, it will happen. In fact, with the Constructal Law, with the colleagues from France, two from France and one from Portugal, we predicted everything. It goes like as follows. Number one, the Earth's climate is a constructal design. It's predictable. So if the properties of the atmosphere, the radiative properties of the atmosphere are not changing, then everything on Earth, from temperature zones, the temperature in each zone, and the speed of the winds is predictable from the Constructal Law. Okay? Now, global warming, we call it, climate change, more generally, happens if you can think of them as the resistances encountered by the streams that flow, in this case radiative heat currents, penetrating the atmosphere, if those resistances are changing as we live. In other words, if the radiative properties of the atmosphere are changing because of particulates, because of gases, pollution, whatever, CO2 and so on, then if you put that into the theory, then you give a time-dependent quality to all these features that are predictable from the Constructal Law. So, in this case, the Constructal theory of climate change puts the ball into the court of those whose job is actually to predict the changes in the properties of the atmosphere. All we could do in this paper that we published about 3 years ago was to say, if the next atmosphere has this transmissivity and this absorptivity and so on, then this will be the new distribution of temperature in the latitudinal direction on Earth. If, on the other hand, the new properties will be these, then this is the, you see here, the uncertainty is in predicting what will happen to the atmosphere. And the reason that is uncertain to predict is because technology changes. It's not only the rate at which fuel is burnt. By the way, no one is slowing down in consuming fuels. No one. Everybody's talking, but no one is doing anything about it, okay? So, but there are lots of people improving the technology of how to do things. Pay attention. This cloud has a thickness. This is the hot dog on the skewer. The hot dog is thick. And the countries in the so-called ventral region of the cloud are, in fact, trying their best to migrate vertically, not only to the right, but also vertically. Take a look at constant fuel consumption. Well, I don't have the particular data here, right? There's an even better drawing. At constant fuel consumption, the per capita, the Russian citizen is consuming the same amount of fuel as the let's say the Swiss or the American, but is more than 10 times less wealthy. You see, the individual wants to be wealthy. CO2 burning fuel is kind of secondary. So there's migration upward through the improvement of technology. It is this evolutionary design. Remember my story with the automobiles and the sailboats? It is that is the technique, the method in which to achieve everything from not only more power per unit, but a cleaner atmosphere and a safer Earth. So the concerns that you bring up are answerable through better science and better technology, because the brute force approach, which is to order people to be poor as opposed to wealthy, will never work. It will not happen. That's been proven by all these failed accords. Now, there is more to this line of thought. History, in fact, teaches how good days are here again, or will be here again. When the railroads started to spread on the globe, that was 150 years ago, the world was exasperated, it was angry, peasantry displaced, people and cattle killed by trains at crossings. It was disaster after disaster after disaster. Now, of course, the world had to become more free, wealthy, and so on, and it achieved that status. But along the way, it got smarter. Railroad crossings became safe. Tunnels, overpasses, all these inventions happened in order to save not Earth back then, but save the civilized landscape. That is the future that will, in fact, happen because of people concerned about everything you mentioned. It's also known as sustainability and renewables and all sorts of, let's call them good intentions, but those will happen naturally as more and more people go to school. How's that? And ask questions and come up with answers. It will not happen overnight because of Stalin-level pronouncements.
We have time perhaps for a very quick question, and Adrian, please, a quick answer. Okay?
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. My question is that if we see the life cycle of different things like human beings, why or etc., why things similar to each other evolve differently? Is it due to the percentage of freedom they have in their life cycles? Like they are time dependent. Somehow everything is time dependent. So how we can predict the time of evolution of something? This is my question.
You mean to predict a lifetime?
Yes.
I forgot the number of the book, the number of the chapter. I think it's in chapter 9 or so. So please get a book and read that. But I'll give you the answer in the simplest and least questionable manner. You take a bowling ball, and bowling ball, okay, or a basketball if you want, and you give it a momentum on the horizontal surface, and that thing, which has initially, it's called energy, travels to a distance, and that travel has a particular time interval. The time interval is the lifetime of that flow system, and the distance is the life travel of that flow system. But this is a very simple thing. You can call it inanimate. Well, what is everything else? The animal, including the Homo sapiens, is a more complicated ball of water running on a wheel. In our case, with two spokes. 2 spokes. I'm going there, driven not by the initial quantity of, let's say, kinetic energy, but by the motive power of an amount of food, which of course is predictable from other gyrations of my thought, predictable to be proportional to my size. Bigger animals need more food to live, you see. And so the animal rolling ball has a lifetime and a life travel. If you are not satisfied enough, then you can think of a packet of water in the river, or a turbulent eddy. So the packet of water is moving longitudinally. The turbulent eddy is a rolling ball rolling inside its own stuff, which is water. Every drone that travels and morphs with freedom eventually dies to a distance after a particular interval. By the way, this is not a new idea. Prandtl's mixing length theory is about this water ball having in his doctrine a recognizable shape called eddy until death, until dissipation. And so you see, ideas, answers to a question have occurred to other people before. What I'm bringing is one answer to all such questions. I began with a thin book, you see. Thin book.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Thank you all of you for attending this lecture, and see you later.